Linda Foster had always been known in Pine Hollow for her unwavering smile and gentle demeanor, even when life had been less than kind to her. The town, with its modest streets lined by weather-worn buildings, harbored people who, like Linda, carried burdens softened only by their resilience. Widowed 5 years ago in a sudden accident that shattered the future she and her husband, Mark, had built, Linda was left to raise their spirited daughter, Ella, alone. She turned their kitchen into a makeshift bakery, selling muffins and fresh bread from a stall by the roadside to make ends meet. Her days began before dawn, flour dusting her hands as she worked tirelessly by the dim light of the old lamp above the stove. The rhythmic kneading of dough became her companion, and the smell of rising bread was the scent of both her solace and her struggle. On days when sales were good, she allowed herself a little extra butter for dinner. But on the days that passed with barely a sale, she would keep her smile as steadfast as she could, hiding the pangs of worry from Ella's wide, brown eyes. Pine Hollow's residents passed by Linda's stall often. Some offered polite nods or warm greetings, while others hurried on, preoccupied with their own troubles. Linda never complained. She understood hardship as intimately as she knew the feel of kneaded dough under her fingers. The townspeople were good at heart, she believed, but burdened themselves. This belief kept her hopeful, even on the hardest days when the cracks in her resolve felt wide enough to split her spirit. That morning, the sun shone with the sharp clarity of early spring, cutting through the chill that lingered in the air. Linda arranged her baked goods, the neat rows of pastries a testament to her effort. She hoped today would bring more customers. As she adjusted the sign she had painted herself, she noticed a boy standing by the old bus stop across the road. He was small, perhaps 10 or 11, with hair unkempt and clothes that seemed to have seen better days. He stared longingly at the bus as it pulled away, a mixture of disappointment and worry etched on his young face. Linda's heart tugged as she watched him shuffle toward the bench and slump down, eyes darting from the passing cars to the ground at his feet. She glanced at her stall, already quieter than usual, and felt the weight of her own struggle, yet something inside her refused to let her stay still. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a small loaf from her display, and crossed the road. "Hey there, sweetie," Linda said gently as she approached the boy. He flinched at first, startled by the sudden voice, but when he saw Linda's kind eyes, he relaxed, though still wary. "You look like you could use something warm," she continued, offering him the small loaf wrapped in wax paper. The boy looked at her, wide-eyed with surprise. Hunger and hesitation battled across his features before he accepted the bread with trembling hands. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. He glanced around, as if afraid someone would come and take it away. Linda noted the thinness of his arms, the dirt smudged on his cheek. It made her heart ache. "What's your name?" she asked, sitting beside him on the worn bench. The boy shifted, unsure whether to share. "I'm Sam," he finally replied, staring at the loaf as if trying to decide if he could truly eat it. Linda smiled softly. "Well, Sam, you're welcome to that bread. Eat up. It's fresh from my oven." Sam looked at her, eyes brimming with an unspoken gratitude, then bit into the loaf hungrily. He chewed slowly at first, savoring each bite, but hunger quickly overcame decorum. Linda watched as his guarded demeanor softened, revealing a vulnerability that seemed too heavy for a child. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked after a moment. Sam swallowed and shook his head. "I was trying to catch the bus to Middletown. My dad lives there. But I didn't have enough for the fare." Linda felt her breath catch. She thought of her own struggles, how one missing coin could mean a skipped meal or another week with a leaking roof. "Does your dad know you're coming?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Sam looked away, a shadow passing over his young face. "I don't know," he whispered. "But I had to leave." The air between them grew still, the gravity of his words pressing down like an unseen weight. Linda didn't need to ask more to understand. There was a desperation in his voice that mirrored her own memories of nights spent wondering how to keep going after Mark was gone. Linda reached into the pocket of her apron, feeling the small stash of crumpled bills she kept for emergencies. It wasn't much, just enough for a few groceries or a repair she'd been putting off. Without allowing doubt to sway her, she pressed the bills into Sam's hand. "This should get you to Middletown," she said softly. Sam's eyes widened as he stared at the money, his face torn between relief and guilt. "I can't take this, ma'am," he stammered, trying to give it back. Linda closed his fingers around the money and smiled, a mix of hope and sadness flickering in her eyes. "Yes, you can, Sam. Just promise me one thing," she said, pausing until he nodded. "Make sure you find your dad. Make sure you're safe." Sam's eyes shimmered with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He nodded slowly, gripping the bills tightly as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Without another word, he stood up and hugged Linda. The embrace was brief but heartfelt, a silent expression of thanks that spoke louder than words. Linda blinked away tears as she watched him sprint toward the next bus that had just come into view. The roar of the engine and the clatter of the bus door opening echoed in her ears. Sam turned one last time, his small face peeking out from the window as he waved to Linda. She raised her hand in return, her heart heavy but warm. As the bus disappeared down the road, the familiar silence of Pine Hollow settled around her. She walked back to her stall, the absence of that crumpled money gnawing at her resolve, but the image of Sam's hopeful smile pushed away any regret. The rest of the day passed in a slow haze. Customers trickled by, some buying a loaf or two, others simply chatting for a moment before moving on. Linda's heart wasn't in the transactions, her mind replaying the scene with Sam over and over. The few coins she earned that day barely made a dent in what she'd given away. As the sun dipped behind the line of pines, casting long shadows across the road, Linda packed up her stall, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Back at home, Ella greeted her with a wide grin, holding up a drawing she'd made in school. "Look, Mama! It's you and me in our bakery." The sketch was simple but full of love, a small wooden cafe with a sign that read "Mom's Bakes." Linda's eyes filled with tears she couldn't let Ella see. "It's perfect, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling her daughter into a hug. As they sat down to dinner, Linda felt the weight of uncertainty press harder against her chest. That night, the wind rattled the windows, and the old roof creaked as if it, too, shared Linda's worries. She lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling and listening to the steady rhythm of Ella's breathing from the next room. She thought about the days ahead, the dwindling flour in the pantry, and the bills that seemed to multiply when she wasn't looking. But intertwined with the anxiety was the memory of Sam's small, relieved smile. A warmth spread through her, softening the sharp edges of her fear. "Maybe I did the right thing," she whispered to the silence, convincing herself that kindness, though costly, was never wasted. The next morning dawned brighter, with crisp spring air that carried a promise of change. Linda set up her stall with renewed determination, pushing aside the nagging worry that she wouldn't sell enough to break even. Just as she finished arranging the last of the loaves, a familiar figure approached. It was Mr. Jensen, her kind neighbor who had once offered to help fix her roof. "Morning, Linda," he said, tipping his hat. "I heard there's a small community grant being offered for local businesses. Thought you might want to apply." He slid a piece of paper toward her with details about the application. Linda's heart leapt at the prospect, but doubt crept in just as quickly. She'd never asked for help beyond her means, always preferring to make do on her own. "I'll think about it," she replied with a faint smile, tucking the paper into her apron pocket. As Mr. Jensen walked away, she felt the paper pressing against her side, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, opportunities could come from unexpected places. The day rolled on with its usual slow pace, broken only by the occasional purchase or kind word. Near midday, Linda noticed a stranger standing across the street, watching her stall intently. He was tall and wore a dark coat, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. Linda's fingers tightened around her apron instinctively, but the man made no move to come closer. Hours passed, and when she looked up again, the man was gone. A strange unease lingered in the pit of her stomach, but she shook it off, convincing herself it was just her mind playing tricks. That evening, as she closed up and counted the day's earnings, Linda couldn't help but feel that something was shifting in her life, an unknown path unfurling before her. The following days brought more sightings of the stranger. He would stand at the corner, hands in pockets, watching Linda with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. She mentioned it to Mr. Jensen in passing, and he chuckled. "Probably someone who's taken a liking to your bread," he joked. But Linda wasn't so sure. Something about the man's presence unsettled her, even as it piqued her curiosity. One morning, as she arranged fresh muffins on the display, he finally approached. Linda's heart thudded in her chest as the man stepped closer, his expression serious but kind. "You may not remember me," he began, his voice low and steady, "but you once helped a boy at this very spot." Linda's eyes widened, and the noise of the world around her seemed to fade as she looked at the man. His face was older, but there was something familiar in his eyes, the same depth of vulnerability she had seen in Sam's all those years ago. Her heart skipped a beat. "Sam?" she whispered, disbelief threading through her voice. He nodded, a smile breaking across his face as if her recognition lifted an invisible weight from his shoulders. "I never forgot what you did for me, Ms. Foster." "That day changed everything," Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "This is my journal from when I was a boy. I wrote about that day, about you. It kept me going through some of the hardest times." Linda reached out, her fingers brushing the cover of the notebook, unable to speak. Memories of that morning, the worry and hope mixed into one fragile gesture, flooded back. Sam looked down at the notebook, his expression wistful. "I found my dad, but it wasn't easy. Life was still tough after that, but your kindness reminded me there were good people out there. It made me believe I could push through." They stood there, the chatter of passers-by drifting around them like background noise. Linda felt a deep, unexplainable pride welling in her chest. She wanted to ask a million questions but could only manage, and now? "What brought you back here?" Sam's smile turned confident, a hint of the man he had become. "I came to Pine Hollow for a reason," he said, reaching into his coat again and pulling out a folded paper. It was an official-looking document. "I've built a life and a business since those days. I started a foundation to help kids in need, inspired by that moment when you gave me hope." Linda's breath caught as he continued. "I want to do more than just visit. I want to invest in your bakery, Ms. Foster. You gave me a chance when I had nothing, and now I want to give that back to you. Let's turn this stall into something bigger, your cafe, just as you always dreamed." Tears pricked the corners of Linda's eyes. She pressed her hand to her mouth, a whirlwind of disbelief and joy swirling within her. "Sam, I don't know what to say." Sam placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Say yes, Linda. Say you'll let me help you." His voice was warm, full of sincerity. Linda stood there, the weight of years of struggle suddenly lifted, if only for a moment. She thought of Ella, her bright-eyed daughter who still drew pictures of their dream cafe, and of Mark, who had always believed in them even from beyond. "I need to think about it," she finally said, her voice quivering. Sam nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take your time. But just know, this offer comes from my heart." He turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back at her. "I'll be at the Pine Cafe tomorrow morning if you'd like to talk more." That night, Linda couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, the folded document Sam had given her resting under her fingertips. She reread it over and over, the words blurring as she imagined what this could mean for her and Ella. A proper bakery with a warm space for customers, the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread filling the air, laughter and conversation spilling from the open windows. But doubt gnawed at her, a familiar old companion. Was this too good to be true? Was she ready for such a change? The thought of failure scared her, the idea of losing everything after finally daring to dream again. She looked at Ella, fast asleep, a smile curving her small lips even in slumber. That smile strengthened Linda's resolve. The next morning, Linda arrived at the Pine Cafe, the same place she had once treated herself and Ella to a hot cocoa on particularly good days. Sam was waiting at a table near the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood as she entered, his eyes lighting up with hope. They talked for hours. Sam shared stories of how he had struggled after finding his father, who had been distant at first but eventually became part of his life again. He told Linda about his journey through foster care, finding mentors who believed in him, and how he had saved every bit of encouragement like treasure. Linda, in turn, opened up about the hard years after Mark's passing, how she had fought to keep going for Ella's sake, and the small victories that had felt monumental. They shared stories and laughter, the connection between them deeper now that they knew each other's stories. By the end of their conversation, Linda felt something shift inside her, a breaking of old chains. "Sam, I think I'm ready," she said, voice steady. Sam's smile was brighter than the morning sun streaming through the window. "Then let's make this dream happen," he said, extending his hand. Linda took it, feeling a surge of hope as their fingers clasped. This was it, she thought. A chance not just to survive, but to thrive. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Sam introduced Linda to his team, a group of bright-eyed professionals who worked with him at the foundation. They explained the process of turning her roadside stall into a full-fledged cafe. Plans were drafted, permits were sought, and the small lot behind her home where Mark had once sketched their dreams became the chosen spot. Ella watched the bustle with wide, excited eyes. "Mama, is this really going to be ours?" she asked one afternoon as she helped Linda pack up the last of their old display stands. Linda smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart. It's going to be ours. Just like we always dreamed." Sam visited regularly, lending his support and making sure everything was moving smoothly. As construction began, Linda couldn't help but feel a twinge of disbelief each time she passed the growing framework of the cafe. The sight filled her with a mix of anticipation and fear, a reminder that life could shift in profound, unexpected ways. Word of Linda's new venture spread quickly through Pine Hollow. Some neighbors, intrigued, stopped by to ask questions or offer congratulations. Others cast doubtful glances, skeptical of whether Linda could pull off such a grand change. Rumors began to circulate at the local market. "Did you hear? Linda's turning her stall into a cafe. Heard some rich man is backing her," one woman whispered to another as they examined vegetables. Linda overheard these murmurs but kept her head high. She knew it wasn't easy for people to understand how kindness could ripple through time, turning strangers into allies. Mr. Jensen, who had always believed in her, stopped by one evening. "You're brave, Linda. Don't let the doubters get to you," he said, handing her a small plant to place in the new cafe. "For luck." Just as Linda began to think things were moving seamlessly, an unexpected setback arose. The construction team discovered an issue with the plumbing that would take longer and cost more than anticipated. The news hit her like a cold wind, chilling her newfound hope. Sam noticed her worry when he visited the site that day. "We'll handle it," he assured her, but Linda shook her head, pride and fear mingling in her chest. "No, Sam. I need to contribute more than just a dream. This cafe has to be ours, not just a gift from you." She spent the next few nights baking late into the evening, selling batches of her famous cinnamon buns to local stores to make extra money. It was hard work, and exhaustion pressed on her like a weight, but it was worth it to know she was fighting for this dream alongside Sam. One day, as Linda packed the last of the cinnamon buns for delivery, a familiar face appeared at her old stall. It was the reporter who had interviewed her years ago for a local story on small businesses. "I heard about your cafe, Linda," he said, holding up his notepad. "I'd like to do a follow-up piece." Linda hesitated at first, wary of more eyes on her venture, but then realized this could be the chance to share her story, her real story. The article was published the following week, recounting not just the cafe's development but the tale of Sam and the days she'd helped him. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. People who had known Linda as just the quiet baker now saw her in a new light. One afternoon, as Linda was finishing preparations for the cafe's interior, a car she didn't recognize pulled up. A tall man in his late 50s stepped out, looking around the construction site with an unreadable expression. Linda felt her heart race. He introduced himself as Mr. Parker, Sam's father. "I wanted to come by and thank you," he said, his voice deep but sincere. "Sam's told me about what you did for him when he was a boy. I failed him then, but you gave him hope when I couldn't." The air between them was thick with unspoken words and regrets, but there was also gratitude. Linda nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "I only did what felt right," she managed. Mr. Parker's gaze softened. "Sometimes, doing what feels right changes everything." As the cafe neared completion, Linda and Ella spent their evenings painting signs and arranging decorations. The once empty lot now stood as a beacon of resilience, its walls painted warm shades of gold and white. Sam walked through the cafe one evening, taking in the scent of fresh paint mixed with the faint memory of Linda's bread. "Looks perfect, Miss Foster," he said, a boyish grin still lighting up his grown-up face. Linda couldn't help but laugh. "It's Linda, Sam. After everything, it has to be." The night before the grand opening, Ella placed the small plant Mr. Jensen had given them by the window. "For luck, Mama," she whispered. Linda hugged her daughter tightly, feeling a sense of completeness that had eluded her for years. The morning of the grand opening dawned clear and bright. The town buzzed with curiosity and excitement as Linda stood behind the counter, dressed in a crisp apron that Ella had decorated with small handprints. The doors opened, and the cafe filled with neighbors, friends, and even the skeptics who had once doubted her. Sam stood beside her, greeting visitors with warmth. He raised his voice over the chatter and shared Linda's story, making sure everyone knew how one act of kindness had sparked a journey that led to this very moment. Linda's eyes welled up as applause filled the room, the sound wrapping around her like a hug. As the crowd thinned, Linda took a quiet moment to look around the cafe. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the edges of the small plant that sat by the sill. Mr. Jensen patted her shoulder as he left, and even Mr. Parker lingered for a moment, giving her a nod of acknowledgement before disappearing into the town square. Ella ran up, holding a muffin in each hand. "We did it, Mama," she exclaimed, eyes bright with pride. Linda knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, we did, my love. We really did." The days following the grand opening were a blur of faces, laughter, and the soft hum of conversations filling the cafe. Linda fell into a new rhythm, waking up before dawn not out of necessity but out of joy. The scent of cinnamon, fresh coffee, and warm bread mingled with the morning light as she prepared the day's pastries. Ella would join her after school, helping out by refilling sugar jars and bringing a playful energy that customers adored. Sam continued to visit, sometimes with business associates, sometimes alone to catch up with Linda. They would talk during the quiet afternoons, when the cafe's rush had subsided and the sun cast golden light through the windows. He shared updates on his foundation's latest projects and stories about kids who reminded him of himself, giving Linda a sense of pride that her simple act of kindness had grown roots far beyond Pine Hollow. One late afternoon, a local businessman named Mr. Langston, who had once scoffed at Linda's stall, walked into the cafe. His presence drew whispers from a few patrons who knew of his critical reputation. He ordered a coffee and sat in the corner, observing. Linda felt the tension tighten in her chest but approached him with the same smile she offered all her customers. "Welcome to Second Chances," she said, her voice steady. Mr. Langston looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face at her genuine warmth. "I see why they named it that," he muttered, almost to himself. After a moment, he looked directly at her. "I was wrong about you, Linda. It seems the town could learn a lot from the way you've risen." He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate." As he left, Linda stood still, the card cool in her hand. It was more than just an offer, it was a testament to how far she'd come, and how even the most hardened hearts could change. One evening, when the cafe had closed for the day and Ella was finishing her homework at a corner table, Sam returned with a group of teenagers from the foundation. They carried guitars, sketch pads, and notebooks, their faces a mix of curiosity and excitement. "I thought this place could use a little music night," Sam said with a grin. The impromptu gathering turned the cafe into a small concert hall, filled with melodies that carried joy and hope. Linda watched as the teens performed, the sound of their laughter blending with the strums of the guitar. Ella clapped along, her eyes bright with admiration for the older kids. When it was Sam's turn, he stood with an old guitar slung across his chest and strummed a song he had written as a boy, inspired by that fateful day at the bus stop. By the end of the night, Linda's heart was full, the cafe now more than just a place to eat, it was a space where stories were shared, dreams were nurtured, and hope grew. She whispered to Ella, who sat on her lap, "This is what your papa and I always dreamed of." As the months passed, Second Chances became a beloved fixture in Pine Hollow. People from nearby towns visited after hearing the story in the newspaper or from friends. Each new face brought with it the possibility of another story, another ripple of kindness to carry forward. Linda learned to embrace the unexpected, seeing that life could hold both heartbreak and unimaginable joy. One crisp autumn morning, Linda stood at the counter, watching as Ella darted out to the small playground that had been built beside the cafe. Sam, who had become a close friend and confidant, sat at his usual spot near the window, nodding a greeting as their eyes met. Thinking about expanding, he teased, gesturing to the line of customers that stretched outside. Linda laughed, the sound light and unburdened. "Maybe," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of possibility. "But for now, I'm just grateful for today." Sam lifted his coffee in a silent toast. "To today," he echoed. And as Linda looked around at the place that had once been only a fragile dream, she felt the warmth of hope radiate deep in her chest. The past had brought her here, but it was the future, bright, uncharted, and full of promise, that beckoned her forward.